Charles Whitmore had always prided himself on knowing every corner of Willowbrook Manor. After 30 years of marriage to Camilla, he believed their sprawling estate held no mysteries. The Victorian mansion, with its winding corridors and ornate chambers, had been their sanctuary, their kingdom built on love and shared dreams. Every room told a story of their life together, from the grand foyer where they'd hosted charity galas to the cozy breakfast nook where they'd shared countless morning conversations. But on that crisp October morning, as golden leaves danced outside the tall windows, Charles discovered he'd been wrong about knowing his own home. It started with a simple leak. The autumn rains had been particularly harsh that year, and water had begun seeping through the ceiling of Camilla's private study. Charles had noticed the dark stain spreading across the ornate plaster during breakfast, while Camilla was away visiting her sister in London, one of her frequent trips that had become more common in recent months. Bloody nuisance, Charles muttered to himself as he climbed the mahogany staircase to the second floor. At 62, he still maintained the vigor of a man 20 years younger, his silver hair neatly combed back, and his blue eyes sharp with intelligence. The construction company he'd built from nothing had made him wealthy, but it had also taught him to handle problems personally when possible. Camilla's study was her sacred space, a room he rarely entered without invitation. Decorated in deep burgundy and gold, it reflected her refined taste and love for classical literature. Tall bookshelves lined the walls, filled with first editions and literary treasures she'd collected over decades. Her antique writing desk sat positioned near the window, where she spent hours each day working on her historical research projects. The water damage was worse than he'd initially thought. The stain had spread across nearly a quarter of the ceiling, and droplets continued to fall steadily onto the Persian rug below. Charles knew he'd need to move Camilla's valuable books and furniture before calling the contractors. As he began relocating items, he noticed something peculiar. The bookshelf against the far wall didn't sit flush against the surface like the others. There was a barely perceptible gap, perhaps an inch, running along its left side. Charles approached for a closer look, running his fingers along the wooden edge. The shelf seemed solid enough, but when he pressed against it, he felt the slightest give. Curious now, Charles examined the shelf more carefully. The books arranged on it were mostly decorative, leather-bound volumes that looked impressive but showed little sign of actual reading. Unlike Camilla's other bookshelves, which were meticulously organized by author and subject, this one seemed randomly arranged. Some books were upside down, others pushed back too far to read their spines clearly. Charles began removing books systematically, setting them carefully on the floor. As the shelf emptied, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Behind where the books had been, carved discreetly into the wood, was a small symbol, a Celtic knot that matched the pattern on Camilla's favorite necklace, the one she'd worn since their early dating days. When he pressed the symbol, he heard a soft click. The entire bookshelf swung inward like a door. Charles stood frozen for several moments, staring at the dark opening that had been revealed. His rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps it was an old servant's passage, common in Victorian homes. Maybe a storage space for valuable items. Camilla might have discovered it years ago and simply forgotten to mention it. But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, a deeper unease settled in his chest. In 30 years of marriage, Camilla had never mentioned a secret room. She'd explored every inch of the manor when they'd first moved in, delighting in its historical features and hidden nooks. How could she have kept this from him? The opening led to a narrow corridor that stretched about 10 feet before opening into a larger space. Charles retrieved a flashlight from the kitchen and returned, his curiosity now overriding his hesitation. The beam revealed stone walls and a low ceiling, suggesting the room had been carved from the original foundation of the house. What he found inside changed everything. The secret room was larger than he'd expected, roughly 12 by 15 feet, with whitewashed walls and modern electrical wiring that had clearly been installed recently. The space was meticulously organized, almost clinical in its precision. A long table dominated the center of the room, covered with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be detailed maps of their town and surrounding areas. But it was the walls that truly captured his attention. They were covered with photographs, hundreds of them. Pictures of people Charles didn't recognize, some with red X marks drawn across their faces. Detailed floor plans of buildings throughout the county, financial records, and bank statements from accounts Charles had never seen before. And everywhere, connected by red string like something from a detective movie, were photographs of Charles himself. Pictures of him leaving his office building. Photos taken through the windows of restaurants where he'd eaten lunch. Images of him playing golf at the country club, completely unaware he was being watched. Some of the photographs appeared to be several years old, based on his appearance and clothing. Charles's hands shook as he moved closer to examine the wall. The photographs weren't random snapshots. They were surveillance images, taken with telephoto lenses from concealed positions. Someone had been watching him, documenting his movements and routines with obsessive detail. In the corner of the room stood a filing cabinet. Charles opened the first drawer with trembling fingers and found folders labeled with dates going back 15 years. Each folder contained more photographs, detailed notes about his activities, and what appeared to be copies of his personal documents, bank statements, business contracts, even medical records from his annual physicals. But it was the second drawer that nearly brought him to his knees. Inside were love letters, dozens of them, written in Camilla's distinctive handwriting. But they weren't addressed to Charles. They were signed "Forever Yours, Isabella," and addressed to someone named Marcus Rivera. Charles sank into the single chair positioned in front of the surveillance wall, his mind reeling. Isabella? He'd never heard Camilla use that name. Who was Marcus Rivera? And why was his own wife conducting what appeared to be an elaborate surveillance operation against him? The letters revealed a passionate affair that had been ongoing for years. References to secret meetings, coded language about the mission, and expressions of love that Charles hadn't heard from Camilla in decades. In one letter, dated just 3 months earlier, Isabella wrote about the final phase and how everything we've worked for will soon be complete. As Charles read through more of the correspondence, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The woman he'd been married to for 30 years, the woman who'd shared his bed and his dreams, who'd hosted dinner parties and charity events at his side, wasn't who she claimed to be. References in the letters suggested that Camilla, or Isabella, had targeted him deliberately from the beginning of their relationship. Their chance meeting at a bookstore in London 31 years ago hadn't been chance at all. It had been a calculated move in what appeared to be a long-term operation whose ultimate purpose remained unclear. Charles found a laptop computer hidden beneath a stack of folders. When he opened it, it was password protected, but the sticky note attached to the screen contained the login information in Camilla's handwriting. Username: Isabella_M. Password: Marcus 1989. The desktop wallpaper was a photo of Camilla embracing a dark-haired man Charles had never seen before. They were standing on a beach somewhere tropical, both smiling with the kind of genuine happiness Charles hadn't seen on his wife's face in years. The timestamp on the photo showed it had been taken just 6 months ago, during one of Camilla's supposed visits to her sister. The computer contained thousands of files. Financial records showing the gradual movement of money from their joint accounts into offshore holdings. Business documents revealing that several of Charles's most profitable contracts had been influenced by information only Camilla could have provided. Email correspondence with various individuals discussing the Whitmore operation and debating the best timing for extraction. But the most devastating discovery was a folder labeled Termination Protocols. Inside were detailed plans for Charles's death, made to look like a heart attack. Medical research about inducing cardiac events in men his age. Contact information for individuals described only as cleanup specialists. The timeline suggested the plan was to be executed within the next 2 months. Charles sat in stunned silence as the full scope of the deception became clear. His wife of 30 years was not only having an affair, she was part of some kind of organized operation that had targeted him from the very beginning of their relationship. Everything he'd believed about his life, his marriage, and the woman he'd loved was a carefully constructed lie. The photos on the wall suddenly made sense. Camilla hadn't been the victim of surveillance. She'd been the one conducting it. She'd been documenting his routines, his vulnerabilities, his habits. She'd been preparing for something, and based on what he'd found in the computer files, that something was his murder. As the afternoon sun slanted through the small window of the secret room, Charles realized that his life as he'd known it was over. The woman sleeping in his bed, eating at his table, and managing his household was a stranger. Worse than a stranger, she was his enemy. The sound of a car in the driveway made his blood run cold. Camilla was home early from London. Charles quickly turned off the laptop and tried to return everything to its original position. His hands shook as he worked, his mind racing with questions and fear. How long did he have before she discovered he knew? What would happen when she realized her secret was exposed? He closed the hidden door behind him and quickly repositioned the books on the shelf, though he knew his arrangement wasn't perfect. Then, he hurried to the main part of the house, trying to compose himself before Camilla found him. "Charles, darling, I'm home." Her voice drifted up from the foyer, warm and familiar. The same voice that had whispered, "I love you" countless times over 3 decades. The same voice that belonged to a woman who was planning his death. "Just upstairs, checking on the leak in your study," he called back, amazed that his voice sounded normal. As he heard her footsteps on the stairs, Charles felt the last remnants of his old life slipping away. The man who had climbed these stairs that morning had been a devoted husband living in a comfortable delusion. The man who stood here now was something else entirely, a target who had accidentally discovered the trap that had been set for him. But he was also a survivor, a man who had built an empire from nothing through intelligence and determination. And, as Camilla's familiar perfume preceded her into the room, Charles began planning his own operation. After 30 years of marriage, he was finally about to meet his wife for the first time. "Oh my goodness, this is dreadful," Camilla exclaimed as she surveyed the water damage in her study. Her reaction seemed genuine. Her face creased with concern as she examined the spreading stain on the ceiling. "When did this start?" Charles watched his wife carefully, studying her expressions and mannerisms with new eyes. The woman standing before him appeared to be the same Camilla he'd known for 3 decades, elegant in her wool coat and cashmere scarf, her auburn hair styled in the sophisticated bob she'd worn for years. But now he saw calculation where he'd once seen spontaneity, performance where he'd once seen authenticity. "This morning, just after you left," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "I've already moved most of your important books to safety." Camilla walked to her bookshelf, the one concealing the secret room, and ran her fingers along the spines of the remaining volumes. Charles held his breath, wondering if she would notice that the books weren't arranged exactly as she'd left them. But she simply nodded and turned away. "Thank you, darling. I suppose we'll need to call someone about the roof." She removed her coat and draped it over her chair. "How was your morning? You look tired." "Just the usual business concerns," Charles lied, marveling at how easily deception came to him now. "Nothing that can't wait." Over dinner that evening, Charles found himself studying Camilla with forensic intensity. Every gesture, every expression, every word was now suspect. When she mentioned her visit with her sister Margaret, he wondered if Margaret even existed. When she asked about his upcoming business trip to Edinburgh, he realized she might be gathering information for her mysterious associates. "The Hendersons called while I was away," Camilla said, cutting into her roasted chicken with precise movements. "They've invited us to their anniversary party next month. I told them we'd be delighted to attend." Charles nodded, though internally he wondered if she expected him to be alive next month. According to the timeline he'd discovered, the termination protocols were scheduled for implementation within 8 weeks. "That sounds lovely," he managed. 40 years of marriage, quite an achievement. "Yes, isn't it wonderful when couples can build something lasting together?" Camilla smiled at him across the table, the same warm smile she'd given him thousands of times before. "I've always admired relationships built on complete trust and honesty." The irony was so profound that Charles almost choked on his wine. Here was a woman who had deceived him for their entire marriage, speaking about trust and honesty with apparent sincerity. Either she was a sociopath, or she was the most accomplished actress he'd ever encountered. After dinner, Charles retreated to his home office while Camilla settled in the living room with a book. Through the years, they developed comfortable evening routines that allowed each other space while remaining companionably close. Now Charles wondered if those routines were simply part of her long-term surveillance strategy. Alone in his office, Charles tried to process what he'd learned and plan his next moves. The rational part of his mind insisted there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding that would make sense of everything he discovered. But the evidence was overwhelming and consistent. The woman he'd married was not who she'd claimed to be. The question now was what to do about it. His first instinct was to confront her directly, to demand explanations and answers. But the files he'd seen suggested that Camilla, or Isabella, was part of a larger organization. If he revealed what he knew prematurely, he might trigger the termination protocols earlier than planned. His second thought was to go to the police. But what exactly would he report? That his wife had a secret room filled with photographs of him? That she was having an affair under an assumed name? That she possessed documents suggesting she might be planning his death? Without more evidence, it would sound like the paranoid fantasies of a jealous husband. Charles opened his computer and began researching private investigators in London. If Camilla could conduct surveillance, so could he. He needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with before deciding how to respond. As he browsed investigative services online, Charles heard Camilla moving around upstairs. The sounds were familiar, her evening routine of checking windows and doors, turning off lights, preparing for bed. But now he wondered if she was actually conducting some kind of security check, ensuring their home remained secure for whatever operation she was running. Around midnight, when he was certain Camilla was asleep, Charles crept back to her study. The house was dark and quiet, filled with the familiar creaks and settling sounds he'd known for years. But now those sounds seemed ominous, as if the house itself was keeping secrets from him. The hidden door opened as easily as before. This time, Charles had brought a small camera to document what he'd found. As he photographed the surveillance wall and the contents of the filing cabinets, he tried to piece together the scope of the operation against him. Some of the financial documents suggested that money had been systematically siphoned from his business accounts for over a decade. The amounts were small enough to avoid detection during routine audits, but they accumulated to hundreds of thousands of pounds over time. The money had been moved through various shell companies before disappearing into offshore accounts he couldn't trace. Other documents revealed that several of his business competitors had received inside information about his contract bids and strategic plans. Projects he'd been certain of winning had been lost to rivals who somehow knew exactly how to undercut his proposals. Deals that should have been confidential had been mysteriously leaked to the press at precisely the wrong moments. The pattern was clear. Camilla had been systematically undermining his business success while maintaining the facade of a supportive wife. She'd celebrated his victories while secretly engineering his defeats. But it was the personal documentation that truly disturbed him. Detailed psychological profiles analyzed his personality, his fears, his weaknesses. Notes about his daily routines included information about his medical appointments, his exercise schedule, even his preferred routes for morning walks. One file contained a comprehensive analysis of his social relationships, identifying which friends and family members might investigate if something happened to him. Plans had been developed to manage potential suspicion from each person on the list. Charles found himself listed as Subject W throughout the documents. There was something dehumanizing about seeing himself reduced to clinical observations and strategic assessments. Subject W prefers routine and becomes anxious when patterns are disrupted. Subject W trusts easily and rarely questions explanations from authority figures. Subject W has strong emotional attachment to deceased parents' memory, potential leverage point. As he read through more files, Charles discovered that Camilla wasn't working alone. References to the team appeared frequently, along with coded communications about various assets and operations beyond their marriage. He appeared to be one target among many. The laptop contained encrypted communication software that Charles couldn't access without specialized technical knowledge. But the email fragments he could read suggested an international scope to whatever organization Camilla represented. References to operations in Madrid, Singapore, and Toronto indicated a global network. One partially decoded message from someone identified only as Control Read. Whitmore operation entering final phase. Extraction team on standby. Ensure all traces eliminated before termination. New assignment awaiting in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires. Charles suddenly remembered Camilla mentioning an interest in South American literature recently. She'd suggested they might take a vacation to Argentina next year. Now he realized she'd likely been preparing him for her disappearance after his death. The methodical nature of the planning was breathtaking in its thoroughness. Every aspect of his life had been analyzed and prepared for manipulation. His business relationships, his family connections, his daily habits, his health concerns, all had been cataloged and weaponized against him. As Charles photographed the final documents, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Footsteps in the corridor outside the study. He quickly turned off his camera and flashlight, plunging the secret room into darkness. The footsteps paused outside the study door, and Charles held his breath, trying to remain completely silent. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the footsteps continued down the hallway. Charles waited another 20 minutes before carefully making his way back to the main house. As he climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, he could hear Camilla's steady breathing from their bed. She appeared to be asleep, but he couldn't be certain. Had she heard him moving around? Was she now aware that her secret had been discovered? The next morning, Camilla seemed perfectly normal during breakfast. She discussed plans for their upcoming charity committee meeting, mentioned needing to shop for winter clothes, and asked if he'd prefer salmon or chicken for dinner. Her behavior was so naturally domestic that Charles almost wondered if he'd imagined everything from the previous day. But when he went to his office to review the photographs he'd taken, the evidence was undeniable. The images were clear and detailed, documenting the elaborate operation that had been conducted against him under the cover of marriage. Charles made a decision. He would continue to act normally while conducting his own investigation. If Camilla could live a double life for 30 years, he could certainly manage it for a few weeks while he gathered the evidence he needed and planned his response. That afternoon, while Camilla was at her book club, Charles drove to London and met with Marcus Thornton, a private investigator recommended by his lawyer. Thornton was a former Scotland Yard detective who specialized in corporate espionage and complex fraud cases. "I need you to investigate my wife," Charles said without preamble, sliding a folder across Thornton's desk. "I have reason to believe she's been conducting a long-term operation against me, possibly involving identity fraud, theft, and conspiracy to commit murder." Thornton raised an eyebrow but opened the folder and examined the photographs Charles had taken. His expression grew increasingly serious as he studied the surveillance wall and the documents. "Mr. Whitmore, this appears to be the work of a professional organization," Thornton said finally. "The level of sophistication suggests intelligence-level training and resources. Have you considered that you might be in immediate danger?" Charles nodded grimly. "That's why I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I make any moves. Can you investigate her background? Find out who she really is?" "I'll need a few weeks to conduct a thorough investigation," Thornton replied. "In the meantime, you should consider your security carefully. If this organization suspects you're aware of their operation, they might accelerate their timeline." As Charles drove back to Willowbrook Manor, he reflected on how completely his life had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, he'd been a successful businessman with a stable marriage. Today, he was the target of an elaborate conspiracy orchestrated by the woman he'd loved and trusted above all others. But he was also discovering reserves of strength and cunning he hadn't known he possessed. 30 years of believing himself to be the victim in this situation had made him underestimate his own capabilities. Now he was beginning to understand that he might be far more dangerous than his enemies realized. The game was no longer one-sided. Charles Whitmore was about to start playing by new rules. The following weeks transformed Charles into someone he barely recognized. By day, he maintained the facade of a devoted husband, sharing meals with Camilla, discussing mundane household matters, and keeping up their social obligations. By night, he became a student of deception, learning to match her performance with one of his own. The private investigator Marcus Thornton called with preliminary findings after 10 days of research. They met at a discreet hotel in central London, far from anywhere Camilla might accidentally encounter them. "Your wife doesn't exist," Thornton said without preamble, spreading documents across the small table between them. "At least, not in the way you know her." Charles felt his stomach clench, even though he'd been expecting this news. "What did you find?" "Camilla Margaret Whitmore, maiden name Harrison, supposedly born in Yorkshire in 1962. There's no record of such a person before 1995. Her birth certificate is a forgery, her educational credentials are fabricated, and her family history is completely fictional." Thornton pulled out a series of photographs. "However, I did find her real identity. Her name is Isabella Maria Santos, born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in 1961. She's a professional operative trained by an organization we believe has connections to several intelligence services, though we're not certain which ones." The photographs showed a younger version of the woman Charles knew as his wife, but in military training scenarios. Isabella Santos rappelling down buildings, practicing hand-to-hand combat, studying surveillance techniques. The transformation from this obviously dangerous operative to the refined English lady he'd married was remarkable. "She speaks at least 6 languages fluently," Thornton continued. "Spanish, English, French, Russian, Mandarin, and Arabic. She's trained in advanced psychology, computer systems, financial manipulation, and what intelligence services call deep cover operations, long-term missions that can last decades." Charles studied the photographs with a mixture of fascination and horror. "What's the purpose of the operation against me?" "That's where things become complex," Thornton admitted. "Your company has government contracts worth hundreds of millions of pounds. Your construction projects include several facilities with national security implications. Someone wanted extensive access to your business operations, your personal relationships, and your financial resources. But why the elaborate marriage? Why not simply recruit me as an asset? Thornton smiled grimly. Because recruiting you would have required your conscious cooperation. This way, you provided access willingly, without ever knowing you were compromised. It's actually quite brilliant, from a strategic perspective. The investigator spread out more documents. I've identified at least 12 other individuals who appear to be targets of similar operations. Successful business people, government officials, military contractors, all married to or in long-term relationships with people whose backgrounds don't withstand scrutiny. Charles realized he was looking at evidence of a massive intelligence operation targeting British infrastructure and defense capabilities. His marriage wasn't personal, it was geopolitical. There's something else, Thornton said, his expression growing more serious. I've been monitoring communications intercepts, and there's increased chatter about asset termination and operation cleanup. Whatever timeline you discovered appears to be accurate. They're preparing to eliminate witnesses and evidence. How long do I have? Based on the patterns we're seeing, probably less than 6 weeks. They're accelerating all their active operations. Charles absorbed this information with surprising calmness. The shock and emotional devastation of the first few days had given way to cold, strategic thinking. What do you recommend? Disappear, Thornton said immediately. Leave the country, assume a new identity, and hope they consider you too insignificant to pursue. I have contacts who can arrange that. Charles considered this option. It would be the safe choice, the sensible choice. But it would also mean abandoning everything he'd built over his lifetime. And it would leave Isabella free to continue her operations against other victims. What if I wanted to turn the tables instead? Charles asked. Thornton raised an eyebrow. That would be extremely dangerous. These aren't common criminals, Mr. Whitmore. They're professionals with significant resources and training. But they have a weakness, Charles replied, his mind working through possibilities. They think I'm still unaware of the operation. They believe they're dealing with a naive businessman who trusts his wife completely. Over the following days, Charles began implementing a plan that was part deception, part trap, and part revenge. He started by making subtle changes to his business operations that would be difficult for Camilla to detect, but would compromise the intelligence she was gathering. He created false documents suggesting his company was bidding on a highly classified government project, a fictional contract that didn't exist but would be irresistibly attractive to foreign intelligence services. He left these documents where Camilla would find them during her regular searches of his office. He also began feeding her false information about his daily routines. He mentioned plans to visit potential project sites that were actually secure government facilities, knowing that any surveillance team sent to those locations would be detected and arrested. Most importantly, he started documenting everything. Hidden cameras were installed throughout the house to record Camilla's activities when she thought she was alone. Audio recording devices captured her phone conversations. Financial tracking software monitored any attempts to access their accounts. The evidence accumulated quickly. Within 2 weeks, Charles had proof of Camilla accessing his computer files, photographing confidential business documents, and conducting encrypted communications with unknown parties. He recorded her making a detailed inspection of the house's security systems and drawing floor plans that could only be intended for a break-in or assault. But the most damning evidence came from a conversation he recorded between Camilla and someone she called Marcus, presumably the man from the love letters. They met at a hotel in London, and Charles followed them there with a professional surveillance team hired through Thornton. The timeline is too aggressive, Camilla was saying as Charles listened through the recording device he'd planted in her purse. Charles is becoming suspicious. He's asking questions about my background, checking our financial accounts more frequently. We should postpone the termination. The orders came from the top level, Marcus replied. His accent suggested Eastern European origins. All operations must be completed before the parliamentary review begins in December. We cannot afford exposure. Then, we accelerate the termination, Camilla said, her voice cold and professional. But I'll need the toxin delivered earlier than planned. Something that mimics natural cardiac arrest in men his age. Charles felt his blood chill as they discussed the specific method of his planned murder. They talked about it with the same casual tone most couples use to plan dinner parties. The cleanup team will need 48 hours after termination to remove all evidence from the house, Marcus continued. Can you ensure he'll be found after that window? I'll arrange to be visiting my sister when it happens, Camilla replied. Perfect alibi, and it gives you time to sanitize the site. As Charles listened to his wife casually planning his death, He realized that any lingering emotional attachment he'd felt toward her was finally dead. The woman he'd loved had never existed. Isabella Santos was a professional killer who had performed the role of loving wife for 3 decades, and now she was preparing to close the performance permanently. That evening, Charles sat across from Camilla at dinner and marveled at her ability to maintain the charade. She asked about his day, discussed plans for their upcoming anniversary celebration, and mentioned wanting to redecorate the guest bedroom. Her performance was flawless. "You seem distracted lately, darling," she said, reaching across to touch his hand. "Is everything all right with the business?" The contact of her skin against his made Charles's stomach turn. This woman had been planning his murder just hours earlier, and now she was touching him with apparent affection. "Just the usual pressures," he replied, forcing himself to smile. "Nothing I can't handle." "You work too hard," Camilla said, her voice warm with concern. "Perhaps we should take a vacation soon. I've been reading about Argentina lately. It sounds fascinating." Charles nearly laughed at the irony. She was already preparing him for her post-murder escape to Buenos Aires, probably where she'd been recruited and trained decades earlier. "That sounds lovely," he said, "after I finish the Henderson project next month." Of course, after the project, Camilla agreed, though they both knew he wouldn't live to complete it. Later that night, as Charles lay in bed listening to Camilla's steady breathing beside him, he reviewed his options. He had enough evidence to expose the operation and probably send Isabella to prison. But he also knew that her organization would simply eliminate him as a security risk if he went to the authorities prematurely. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his best chance for survival lay not in defense, but in offense. Isabella and her handlers believed they were dealing with an easy target. They had no idea that Charles had spent the last 30 years learning about business strategy, negotiation, and psychological manipulation from some of the most ruthless people in the construction industry. They were about to discover that their victim was far more dangerous than they calculated. Charles began reaching out to contacts he'd made during his decades in business, people who operated in the gray areas between legal commerce and organized crime. Construction was an industry that attracted individuals with flexible morals and specialized skills. Over the years, Charles had maintained relationships with such people, understanding that business sometimes required unconventional solutions. Within a week, he had assembled a team of his own. Former military contractors who specialized in surveillance and counterintelligence. Security specialists who could make people disappear without leaving traces. Financial experts who understood how to manipulate international banking systems. If Isabella wanted to play the game at a professional level, Charles was prepared to match her. But, unlike her, he wasn't constrained by the bureaucratic limitations of an intelligence organization. He had the resources of a successful businessman and the motivation of a man fighting for his life. The hunter was about to become the hunted. As November arrived and the leaves turned golden around Willowbrook Manor, Charles put his plan into motion. Isabella believed she was managing the final phase of a 30-year operation. Instead, she was about to discover that her target had become her greatest threat. The game was changing, and Charles intended to win. The chess game began in earnest when Charles decided to force Isabella's hand. Instead of waiting passively for her to implement her termination plan, he created a scenario that would compel her to act prematurely, under conditions he controlled. Working with his assembled team of security specialists, Charles fabricated evidence suggesting that British intelligence had become aware of the operation against him. He planted documents in his office computer indicating that MI5 was conducting a security review of all government contractors, with specific focus on potential foreign infiltration of their personal lives. The bait was irresistible. Any intelligence operation would have to abort immediately upon learning that counterintelligence was closing in. Isabella would be forced to accelerate her timeline, but she'd also be operating under pressure and stress rather than according to her carefully planned schedule. Charles monitored her communications and behavior closely over the following days. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within hours of accessing his computer files, Isabella had initiated emergency protocols. Her encrypted communications increased dramatically, and she began making preparations that suggested immediate evacuation. But she also made a critical error. She underestimated Charles. "Darling, I have terrible news," Isabella announced over breakfast 3 days after Charles had planted the false intelligence documents. Her performance was as flawless as always, genuine distress, perfectly timed emotional responses, convincing tears. My sister Margaret has been in an accident. She's in hospital in London, and they don't know if she'll recover. Charles expressed appropriate concern and sympathy, though he now knew that Margaret Harrison, like Camilla Harrison Whitmore, was a fictional character. Isabella was creating an excuse to be away from the house when Charles's accident occurred. Of course you must go to her immediately, Charles said, taking her hand with apparent tenderness. Stay as long as you need. I'll manage everything here. You're so understanding, Isabella replied, squeezing his fingers with what seemed like genuine gratitude. I should leave this afternoon. The doctors say the next 48 hours are critical. Charles helped her pack, playing the role of the supportive husband while internally marveling at her composure. This woman was preparing to murder him while accepting his assistance with her luggage. The performance was professional in its ruthlessness. After Isabella departed for London, Charles activated the full scope of his counter-operation. His security team had spent weeks preparing Willowbrook Manor for what was about to unfold. Every room was monitored by hidden cameras, every entrance was covered by motion sensors, and every potential escape route was watched by skilled professionals. The attack came that night, precisely as Charles had predicted. A team of 3 professionals entered the manor using keys that Isabella had provided. They moved through the house with obvious familiarity, heading directly toward the master bedroom where Charles should have been sleeping. Instead, they found a carefully arranged scene. Pillows shaped like a sleeping figure under the covers, complete with an audio device providing the sound of steady breathing. The team didn't realize their mistake until the house's security system activated, locking down all exits and flooding every room with bright lights. Gentlemen, Charles's voice echoed through the house's intercom system. Welcome to my home. I'm afraid you'll be staying longer than you planned. The 3 intruders were quickly subdued by Charles's security team. One carried a syringe containing what laboratory analysis later confirmed was a sophisticated toxin designed to mimic heart attack symptoms. Another had equipment for staging the scene to support a natural death conclusion. The third carried documents authorizing the complete sanitization of the property. Under interrogation, the team revealed details about the broader operation that even Charles's investigation hadn't uncovered. Isabella Santos was a senior operative in an organization that conducted long-term industrial espionage for multiple client states. Her mission in Britain had involved compromising dozens of high-value targets across defense, technology, and government sectors. Charles's case was simply one among many, though his company's government contracts made him a particularly valuable asset. The intelligence gathered through Isabella over 30 years had been used to manipulate British defense contracts worth billions of pounds. But the most shocking revelation was that Charles hadn't been randomly selected. His father, who had died when Charles was 25, had been involved in early British nuclear weapons development. The operation against Charles had originally been designed to gather historical intelligence about his father's work. It had only expanded into commercial espionage when Charles's own business became successful. Your father cost us a significant weapons development program in the 1960s, one of the captured operatives explained. This was always about revenge as much as intelligence. Charles realized that Isabella's infiltration of his life was the culmination of a multi-generational operation. She hadn't just stolen 30 years of his life, she'd been systematically destroying his family's legacy. Armed with this knowledge, Charles made a decision that surprised even his security team. Instead of turning the captured operatives over to British intelligence, he implemented his own justice. Using the financial resources he'd built over decades, Charles orchestrated the complete destruction of Isabella's organization. The captured operatives provided access codes and communication protocols that allowed Charles's team to infiltrate the group's networks. Within weeks, safe houses were compromised, operational funds were frozen, and carefully maintained cover identities were exposed to hostile intelligence services. The organization that had operated in shadows for decades suddenly found itself illuminated by unwanted attention from multiple government agencies across several continents. Assets that had taken years to position were burned in a matter of days. But Charles's most elegant revenge was reserved for Isabella herself. Using the same techniques she had employed against him, Charles created an elaborate deception designed to destroy her psychologically before eliminating her operationally. He allowed her to believe that her mission had been successful, that Charles had died as planned, and that she was free to evacuate to her new assignment in Buenos Aires. Isabella returned to Willowbrook Manor after 3 days, expecting to find Charles dead and the house sanitized by her cleanup team. Instead, she discovered a scene that must have seemed impossible. Charles very much alive, calmly reading a book in his study, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Hello, Isabella," Charles said without looking up from his book. The use of her real name froze her in the doorway. "I trust your sister is recovering well from her fictional accident." For the first time in their 30-year relationship, Charles saw Isabella's professional composure crack. Her carefully maintained English accent slipped, revealing hints of her native Spanish. Her perfect posture sagged as she realized the magnitude of her exposure. "I don't understand," she said, though her eyes were already calculating escape routes and response options. "Of course you do," Charles replied, finally, setting down his book and looking directly at her. "You understand perfectly. The question is what happens next." Charles had prepared for this moment carefully. Isabella was a trained operative with decades of experience in violent situations. Despite her current shock, she would quickly recover and become extremely dangerous if she felt cornered. "Your cleanup team is in custody," Charles continued conversationally. "Your organization's networks have been compromised. Your operational funds have been seized. Your escape routes have been monitored. And every intelligence service in Western Europe now knows who you really are." Isabella's transformation was remarkable to witness. The gentle English lady disappeared completely, replaced by the cold professional operative she'd always been underneath. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to killing without hesitation. "What do you want?" she asked. "Justice," Charles replied simply. 30 years of my life, stolen through deception. My father's legacy, corrupted by your vendetta. My business reputation, damaged by your intelligence gathering. My sense of reality, destroyed by your performance. "You could have simply killed me," Isabella observed. "Why this elaborate revelation?" Charles smiled, and, for the first time, Isabella seemed to recognize that she might have underestimated him. "Because I wanted you to understand what it feels like to discover that your entire reality is a lie. I wanted you to experience the same psychological destruction you inflicted on me. And now," Charles reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a single airplane ticket. "Buenos Aires," he said, placing it on the desk between them. "One way. Your handlers believe you're coming home to receive a commendation for successfully completing the longest deep cover operation in your organization's history." Isabella approached the desk cautiously and examined the ticket. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Charles replied. "You're free to leave. Return to Argentina, report your success, accept your accolades. Enjoy your retirement." "You're letting me go?" Charles's smile broadened, and Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. "Of course. After all, someone needs to deliver my message to your superiors." "What message?" Charles opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. It displayed a video feed showing multiple locations, safe houses, training facilities, operational headquarters, all under assault by various law enforcement and intelligence agencies. "The message is simple," Charles explained. "This is what happens when you target my family. Your organization spent 30 years destroying my life. I've spent 30 days destroying your organization." Isabella stared at the screen, watching decades of carefully constructed infrastructure being dismantled in real time. "This is impossible." "No one man could." "You're right," Charles interrupted. "No one man could. But, fortunately, you taught me the value of building the right kind of team." As Isabella watched her life's work crumble on the computer screen, Charles delivered the final blow. "I've also taken the liberty of informing your Argentine handlers about certain financial irregularities in your operational accounts," he said. "Funds that were supposed to be returned to Buenos Aires, but somehow found their way into personal offshore holdings. I believe they'll want to discuss those discrepancies when you arrive." Isabella's face went pale as she understood the full scope of Charles's revenge. He hadn't just exposed her operation. He'd framed her for embezzlement and treason against her own organization. "They'll kill me," she whispered. "Probably," Charles agreed. "But that's not really my concern anymore." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the desk that had once symbolized Charles's domestic happiness. Now it represented the boundary between justice and vengeance. 30 years, Isabella said finally. "Did any of it mean anything to you?" Charles considered the question seriously. "For 30 years, I loved a woman who never existed. I mourned her death the day I discovered this room. What's sitting in front of me now is a stranger who stole my life and is finally paying the price." Isabella took the plane ticket and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. "For what it's worth," she said, "there were moments when I almost forgot who I really was." "I'm sure there were," Charles replied, "but not enough of them. After Isabella left Willowbrook Manor for the final time, Charles sat in his study and contemplated the ruins of his old life. Everything he believed about his marriage, his home, and his sense of identity had been destroyed. But from those ruins, something new had emerged, a man who understood the true nature of power and the price of justice. The innocent businessman who had climbed the stairs to check on a water leak was gone forever. In his place stood someone far more dangerous and infinitely wiser. Charles Whitmore had learned to play by new rules, and he discovered he was very good at the game. 6 months later, Charles stood in the renovated study of Willowbrook Manor, watching contractors remove the last traces of the hidden room that had changed his life forever. The secret chamber had been filled with concrete and sealed permanently. The bookshelf that had concealed it was gone, replaced by a floor-to-ceiling window that flooded the space with natural light. The water damage that had started everything had been repaired long ago, but Charles had continued the renovations throughout the house. Every room where Isabella Santos had lived and worked had been gutted and rebuilt. It was both practical necessity and psychological healing. He was literally reconstructing his life from the ground up. Marcus Thornton arrived as the last contractor was leaving. The private investigator had become something more than a business associate over the past months. Their shared experience in dismantling Isabella's organization had forged a partnership built on mutual respect and complementary skills. The final reports came in from Buenos Aires, Thornton said, settling into one of the new leather chairs Charles had installed. Isabella Santos was found dead in her hotel room 3 days after arriving in Argentina. Official cause of death was heart failure, but our sources suggest it was much more creative than that. Charles felt no satisfaction at the news, only a sense of completion. Her handlers discovered the financial irregularities, among other things. Apparently, your information about her embezzlement was just the beginning. Once they started investigating her background, they found inconsistencies going back years. The organization doesn't tolerate uncertainty about their operatives' loyalty. Charles nodded. He had engineered Isabella's destruction with surgical precision, but the final act had been performed by her own people. There was a certain poetic justice in that outcome. What about the other operations? Charles asked. Thornton consulted his notes. 11 more deep-cover marriages were exposed and terminated. The targets are all receiving counseling and protection. The organization's entire Western European network has been rolled up. Conservative estimates suggest we prevented hundreds of millions of pounds in economic damage. The scope of the conspiracy had grown far beyond Charles's initial understanding. Isabella's operation had been part of a comprehensive assault on British infrastructure that included defense contractors, technology companies, and government agencies. By exposing one thread, Charles had unraveled an entire intelligence network. The Americans have been particularly grateful, Thornton continued. 3 of the exposed operatives were targeting defense contractors working on joint US-UK projects. The CIA has offered you a rather substantial consulting fee for your cooperation. Charles waved dismissively. He had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. His motivation had never been financial. What about the other victims? Are they recovering? That's more complicated, Thornton admitted. Some are handling it better than others. Harold Morrison, his wife, had been gathering intelligence on his aerospace contracts for 15 years. He's doing well. Remarried already, actually. But Jennifer Hartwell discovered that her husband of 22 years was feeding information about her diplomatic communications to hostile intelligence services. She's struggling. Charles understood. The psychological damage from discovering that your most intimate relationship was built on deception could be devastating. He'd been fortunate to have the resources and temperament to transform his trauma into effective action. Not everyone possessed those advantages. I've been thinking about establishing a foundation, Charles said. Support services for people who've been victims of long-term intelligence operations. Counseling, legal assistance, financial protection. What do you think? Thornton smiled. I think Isabella Santos would hate knowing that her victims are being helped by the fortune she helped you accumulate. Over the following weeks, Charles threw himself into establishing what he called the Harrison Foundation, a bitter irony that only he and Thornton would understand. The organization would provide comprehensive support for individuals whose lives had been compromised by foreign intelligence operations. But, as Charles worked on the foundation, he also found himself drawn into more direct activities. His success in destroying Isabella's network had come to the attention of various government agencies, who began approaching him with requests for assistance on other cases. You have a unique skill set, explained Director Sarah Matthews from MI5 during a meeting at a London hotel. You understand how these operations work from the victim's perspective, but you also have the business acumen to identify their vulnerabilities. We'd like you to consider consulting work. Charles was intrigued despite himself. What kind of consulting? Industrial counterintelligence. Helping British companies identify and neutralize foreign infiltration. You'd be protecting other potential victims while serving your country's interests. The work appealed to Charles on multiple levels. It would give purpose to his hard-won expertise, provide justice for people in situations similar to his own, and allow him to continue the fight against organizations like the one that had destroyed his marriage. I'd want complete operational independence, Charles specified. No bureaucratic oversight, no political interference. I choose the cases, I set the methods, I determine the outcomes. Agreed, Director Matthews said immediately. Your track record suggests you're more effective operating independently anyway. Within a month, Charles found himself leading a private counterintelligence organization funded by government contracts, but operating with complete autonomy. His team included former military personnel, retired intelligence officers, and specialists in financial crime. They called themselves Whitmore Security Consulting, and their reputation spread quickly through the shadowy world of corporate espionage. Their first major case involved a technology company whose chief financial officer had been married for 12 years to a woman who was systematically stealing proprietary information about advanced semiconductor designs. Using techniques Charles had refined during his experience with Isabella, they exposed the operation and captured the entire intelligence network supporting it. The second case was more complex. A government minister whose romantic relationship was being used to influence British policy toward a particular Central Asian republic. The operation had been running for 8 years and had already affected several major diplomatic initiatives. Charles's team unraveled it in 6 weeks. With each success, Charles felt himself growing more sophisticated in his understanding of how intelligence operations functioned. He learned to think like his opponents, to anticipate their strategies, and to exploit their assumptions about their targets. But success came with a price. As Charles's reputation grew, so did the danger he faced. Hostile intelligence services began targeting him directly, seeing his organization as a threat to their operations in Britain. The first attempt on his life came during what should have been a routine meeting with a potential client. Charles arrived at the designated London office building to find that the company requesting his services didn't exist. The building's security cameras had been disabled, and armed men were waiting in the conference room. Charles escaped only because his years of experience had taught him to always have multiple exit strategies and backup plans. The attackers were professionals, but they had underestimated both his paranoia and his preparation. They're escalating, Thornton observed during their debrief following the incident. Your success rate is making you a priority target. Charles nodded. He had expected this development. Then, we escalate as well. It's time to take the fight to them instead of simply responding to their operations. Over the following months, Charles's organization transformed from a defensive counterintelligence group into something far more aggressive. Instead of waiting for foreign intelligence services to target British assets, they began proactively identifying and disrupting hostile operations before they could mature. They developed techniques for identifying foreign operatives based on financial patterns, communication behaviors, and social network analysis. They created false operations designed to attract and expose enemy agents. Most controversially, they began conducting their own infiltration operations against hostile intelligence services. You're becoming what you once fought against, Thornton warned during one of their strategic planning sessions. The line between protecting Britain and conducting your own intelligence operations is getting blurrier. Charles considered this observation seriously. There was truth in it. His organization now employed many of the same techniques that Isabella's people had used against him. They maintained false identities, conducted long-term surveillance operations, and manipulated targets through deception and misdirection. But there was a crucial difference. Charles's operations were designed to protect innocent people from the kind of violation he had experienced. Every technique he employed was in service of preventing others from suffering the psychological destruction that had nearly destroyed him. I'm not becoming them, Charles replied finally. I'm becoming their worst nightmare. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from one of Charles's field teams. They had identified what appeared to be a massive operation targeting multiple British defense contractors simultaneously. The scope was larger than anything they had encountered before. How many targets? Charles asked. At least 30 confirmed, possibly more. It looks like a coordinated assault on Britain's entire defense industrial base. Charles felt the familiar surge of energy that came with a new challenge. This was exactly the kind of operation that his organization existed to stop. "Mobilize everyone," he ordered. "This is what we've been preparing for." As his team sprang into action, Charles reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that October morning when he discovered water damage in Isabella's study. The naive businessman who had trusted completely was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous. But, perhaps most importantly, he had found a purpose that gave meaning to his suffering. Every operation he disrupted, every innocent person he protected, every hostile agent he exposed was a small act of justice for what Isabella had done to him. The hidden door she had created to conceal her deception had ultimately become the gateway to his transformation. In trying to destroy him, she had created her most effective enemy. Charles Whitmore had learned to fight in the shadows, and he discovered he was very good at it. The war against those who would steal people's lives through deception had become his calling, and he intended to wage it with all the skill and ruthlessness his enemies had taught him. Isabella Santos was dead, but her legacy lived on in every operation Charles disrupted and every victim he saved. In the end, her greatest success had been creating the one person capable of destroying everything she had worked to build. The student had become the master, and the hunter had become the guardian. Charles stood at the window of his renovated study, looking out over the grounds of Willowbrook Manor, and smiled grimly. Somewhere in the world, hostile operatives were planning operations against innocent people. They had no idea what was coming for them. But they would learn, just as Isabella Santos had learned in her final moments in Buenos Aires. Charles Whitmore was no longer anyone's victim, and he had become very good at ensuring that others wouldn't be either. The game continued, but the rules had changed forever, and Charles intended to keep winning.